The constant low hum of St. Jude's Hospital was a symphony Arthur Jenkins had conducted for 12 years. He knew its every note, the steady beep, beep, beep of the ICU monitors, the hushed, urgent conferences outside critical rooms, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, and the distant, tinny echo of a PA system calling for doctors who were always running. For over a decade, he'd moved through the corridors like a ghost, a mop and bucket his constant companions. He was the man who cleaned up the mess, both visible and invisible. He saw the things the doctors and nurses, in their frantic rush to save lives, often missed. The crumpled tissue clutched in a father's hand, the half-finished crossword abandoned on a bedside table, the profound, echoing silence of a room after its occupant had been wheeled away. He was a noticer. It was his curse and his solace. His shift began as the day staff's energy began to wane, replaced by the quieter, more solemn rhythm of the night. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz with a different frequency, casting long shadows that hid the day's tragedies and promised a few hours of respite. It was during these hours that he first truly noticed her. Room 307, Mabel Peterson. Mabel was a portrait of stillness and the constant motion. She spent her days propped against a mountain of white pillows, her hands, a delicate map of blue veins and thin skin, resting on the starched sheet. Her eyes, a faded but intelligent blue, followed the comings and goings outside her door with a gentle curiosity. She would smile, a small, tentative thing, whenever a nurse entered to check her vitals. But the smiles were rarely returned, or if they were, it was a quick, professional flicker before the nurse's attention returned to the chart. "Blood pressure stable, Mabel," a young, efficient nurse named Davis would say, her fingers wrapped around Mabel's wrist, counting pulses, but never truly touching her. "The doctor will make his rounds in the morning. You need anything, just press the button." But Mabel rarely pressed the button. She'd tried early on. A request for an extra blanket to fight the institutional chill had taken 45 minutes. A question about her new medication was met with a distracted, "I'll have to check with the doctor," a check that never materialized. She had become part of the room's furniture, another piece of medical equipment to be monitored and maintained, but not seen. Not truly. Her son, David, a kind but perpetually worried man with the weary air of someone carrying too much debt, visited twice a week. His visits were a whirlwind of awkward small talk and phone calls he had to take from work, his eyes darting between his mother and his smartphone. The loneliness that settled in after he left was a colder chill than any the hospital air conditioning could muster. It was a deep, aching void. One evening, Arthur pushed his cleaning cart softly into her room. The wheels were well-oiled, silent. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to belong to the night itself. "Mind if I tidy up a bit?" Mabel turned her head slowly. Most staff didn't announce themselves. They just entered and began their tasks. "Not at all," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. Arthur worked with a quiet, efficient grace. He wasn't just moving dirt around. He was restoring order. He moved a chair to dust under it, wiped the windowsill with a careful hand, and meticulously mopped the floor in smooth, overlapping arcs. As he worked near her bed, his eyes fell on the single photograph on her bedside table. A much younger Mabel, her face radiant and unlined, laughing with her head thrown back, stood next to a handsome man in a crisp Air Force uniform, his arm wrapped protectively around her. Between them, a boy of about 10 grinned, missing a front tooth. "That's a fine-looking family," Arthur said, not out of mere politeness, but because he genuinely meant it. He'd seen thousands of family photos in these rooms, but this one pulsed with a tangible joy. A light sparked in Mabel's eyes, cutting through the haze of medication and fatigue. "That's George," she said, her finger tracing the air near the man's face. "My husband. Gone 20 years now. Lung cancer. He was a mechanic, could fix anything." Her voice gained a little strength. "And that's our David. He was such a lively boy, full of dreams. Wanted to be a pilot, just like his dad." "He still is, I expect," Arthur said, pausing his work and leaning slightly on the mop handle. "Comes to see you, doesn't he? That makes him a good man in my book." "He is," Mabel agreed, a real warm smile touching her lips for the first time in days. He gets so tangled up in providing that he forgets to just be. She looked at Arthur, her head tilted. You notice things, don't you? Arthur simply nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. He was a noticer. It was his job. It was his nature. From that night on, a ritual was born. Arthur's entry into room 307 was no longer just a cleaning visit. It was a social call. He started spending a few extra minutes. He'd ask about George, about her life before the four walls of the hospital. He began bringing her things. Not anything against the rules, just small tokens. An extra tea bag from the staff room. Earl Grey, I overheard you say you liked it once. A day-old newspaper from the lobby that someone had left behind. One night, he brought a small, slightly wilted daisy he'd picked from the edge of the hospital's landscaping. Looks like it needed a home, he'd grumbled, placing it in a paper cup of water on her table. Mabel's eyes had shone with tears he pretended not to see. In return, Mabel shared her stories. She painted vivid pictures with her words, dancing with George at a USO club. In 1955, the scratchy wool of his uniform, the smell of his Old Spice cologne. She spoke of the terrifying and exhilarating cross-country move to California with a 6-month-old David, knowing no one. She spoke of pride and fear watching David grow up, of his dream of flying fading into a more practical degree in accounting. She spoke of regrets too, a harsh word spoken in anger to George that she could never take back. A trip to Paris they'd always talked about, but never booked. We thought we had more time, she whispered, her voice thick with a sorrow that was decades old yet still fresh. Always think you have more time. Arthur, in his turn, began to open up in a way he hadn't with anyone in years. The words came slowly, cautiously at first. He spoke of his own life, of a marriage that had dissolved not in a blaze of anger, but in a slow, quiet dying of the light. He spoke of his son, Michael, a bright boy who'd loved baseball. He confessed the origin of the rift, a Little League championship game 10 years ago that Arthur, working a double shift to pay the bills, had missed. He'd promised he'd be there. He wasn't. He struck out looking, final out of the game, said he was looking for me in the stands instead of the ball, Arthur said, the memory of physical pain even now. I tried to apologize, to explain, but he just shut down. Then he grew up, went to college on the other side of the country, calls on birthdays, Christmas. It's polite. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He spoke of the strange peace he found in his work, in the act of cleansing, of making things right and orderly, even if it was just a clean floor in a place of chaos. They were an unlikely pair. The elderly, fading widow who had once been the life of the party, and the gruff, solitary janitor who carried the weight of his own quiet regrets. Yet, in the silent, antiseptic world of the night hospital, they built a fortress of shared confidences. Arthur became more than a cleaner. He was her advocate, her nighttime guardian. He'd subtly fluff her pillows before he left. He'd notice her water pitcher was empty and fill it without being asked, placing the cup with the bendy straw carefully within her reach. He was the one who saw the flicker of pain she tried to hide behind a brave face and would later mention it quietly to a different, more attentive nurse on the day shift. Just seems like Mrs. Peterson in 307 is having a rough time today, he'd mutter, not making eye contact. It was all he could do. The crisis came on a Tuesday, the night the hospital was at its quietest. Arthur was buffing the floor down the hall when he heard a change in Mabel's breathing from her open door. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic sound of sleep. It was a shallow, ragged, wet gasp. He was at her side in an instant. Her face was pale, a waxy sheen on her skin, her lips tinged with a terrifying blue. She was clutching at her chest, her eyes wide with a silent, animal panic. Arthur hit the call button, the urgent red light blinking above the door. But his medical training was old and basic, from a brief stint as an orderly decades ago. Instead of waiting, he did what felt human. He sat on the edge of her bed, carefully ignoring the hospital protocol that screamed in his head, and took her hand. It was cold and clammy. "Look at me, Mabel," he said, his voice firm but calm, an anchor in her storm of fear. He leaned close, blocking out the frightening view of the machines. "Look right at me. You're not alone. I'm right here. They're coming. Just breathe with me In and out. That's it. In and out. He kept his eyes locked on hers, his own breathing exaggerated, willing her to follow his rhythm. He used a clean cloth from his cart to wipe a sheen of cold sweat from her forehead. He talked to her, his voice a steady murmur. You're okay. You're strong. Think about George. Think about that dance. In that moment, he wasn't a janitor and she wasn't a patient. They were just two human souls, one desperately trying to keep the other from slipping into the abyss. The medical team, led by Nurse Davis, burst into the room, their controlled efficiency a stark contrast to Arthur's raw, quiet empathy. He was gently but firmly pushed aside as they surrounded the bed, a whirlwind of shouted stats, snapping gloves, and the rip of plastic packaging. Arthur stood by the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs, feeling utterly useless again. As they stabilized her, preparing to move her for more tests, Nurse Davis glanced at him, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps surprise, perhaps professional contempt in her eyes. You can go now, Arthur. We have it. But he didn't go far. He waited in the dimly lit hallway until the flurry of activity subsided and Mabel was returned to her room, asleep under the influence of powerful drugs, but stable, the steady beep of the heart monitor, a comforting sound. The next night, the air in room 307 was different. It was quieter, heavier, as if the life was already slowly leaching out of it. Mabel was weaker, her voice a thin, breathy thread of sound. She seemed smaller in the bed, as if she were already beginning to fade into the sheets. She didn't talk about the past. Instead, she talked about now, about him. You have been so kind to me, Arthur, she whispered, her eyes luminous in the dim light he'd left on for her. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. Wasn't hard to see you, Mabel, he said, his throat so tight it hurt. You're a difficult woman to miss. She gave a weak, breathy laugh that turned into a cough. When she recovered, she gestured feebly toward the drawer of her bedside table. In there, an envelope. For David. Would you make sure he gets it? Personally? Arthur nodded, a solemn vow. He opened the drawer. Inside was a simple white envelope with David written in a shaky, yet still elegant script. He took it. It felt heavier than it should. And for you, she said, her eyes closing, her energy spent. There's a little something for you in there too, for noticing, for seeing me. Arthur's hand trembled slightly as he held the envelope. Thank you, Mabel. She found his hand and squeezed it with a strength that surprised him, a final burst of vitality. No, Arthur, thank you. Now tell me about your boy. Tell me about Michael again. Tell me about the baseball player. And so he did. He talked until her breathing became deep and regular, until she fell into a peaceful drug sleep. He finished his cleaning, his movements slower, more deliberate than usual. Before he left, he adjusted her blanket and looked at her face, serene and finally at rest. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was goodbye. He placed a hand on her forehead for a moment, a final silent gesture of farewell. Rest easy, Mabel, he murmured. Mabel Peterson passed away in her sleep just before dawn. The following days were a blur of mundane routine for Arthur, but the world felt muted, the hospital's hum a duller sound. A week later, he saw a man he recognized as David Peterson sitting in the lobby, looking lost and grief-stricken, a small box of his mother's belongings on his lap. Arthur, who had been carrying Mabel's envelope with him every shift, waiting for this moment, approached him cautiously. Mr. Peterson? David? Arthur said, his voice soft. I'm Arthur Jenkins. I worked the nights on your mother's floor. David looked up, confusion on his face. Oh, yes, hello. He looked like he hadn't slept. I'm so very sorry for your loss, Arthur said, and the words were genuine, weighted with a shared unspoken grief. Your mother was a remarkable woman. She spoke of you often. She was very proud of you. He held out the envelope. She asked me to make sure you got this, personally. David took it, his eyes welling up. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He seemed to need a connection to the stranger who had known a version of his mother he hadn't. He opened the envelope right there. Inside were several pages of handwritten letter. As he began to read, his face shifted from grief to something more complex, a mixture of pain, love, profound regret, and dawning understanding. He swallowed hard, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes wide with awe. She talks about you in here. She says you were her friend, her nighttime guardian angel, that you brought her peace and made her feel human again. He swallowed again, hard. She says I should stop working so much, that life is too short and that my father would have wanted me to live it, not just fund it. He looked down at the letter, his voice dropping to a whisper. She knew about the layoffs. She knew I was worried. I never told her. Arthur simply nodded. Mabel had noticed everything. David pulled out a second, smaller item from the envelope. It was an old, slightly faded color photograph Arthur had never seen before. It showed a young Mabel and George, not in a formal studio pose, but laughing on a windswept beach. Their hair was messy. George was dipping Mabel dramatically, and they were both laughing, utterly in love and utterly present in the moment. Written on the back in the same elegant hand were the words, "For Arthur, a reminder to find your own beach. The world needs more men who notice. And to call your son, life is now with all my gratitude, Mabel." Tucked behind the photo was a smaller slip of paper. It was a gift card to a nice family-style steakhouse. Enough for 2 meals. On it, Mabel had written a single word, "Michael." Arthur felt the world tilt on its axis. His breath caught in his chest. This frail, kind woman, whom the bustling medical system had written off and ignored, had been noticing him right back. She had seen right through the gruff janitor's exterior to the lonely, regretful man beneath. She had heard the pain in his stories about Michael, had diagnosed the wound he carried every day, and with her final, powerful act, had given him not just a gift, but a prescription, a command, a purpose. She had handed him the key to his own prison. He looked from the photograph of vibrant, joyous, unconditional love to the gift card for a meal meant for 2. He thought of the baseball game, the missed promise, the decade of polite distance, the puzzle pieces of their late-night conversations, his regrets, her wisdom, all snapped together in that instant into a perfect, heartbreaking, and breathtakingly beautiful picture. She hadn't just given him a token of thanks, she had given him a roadmap back to his own life, back to his son. "Wow," David whispered, reading the final lines of his letter, echoing the word that was screaming in Arthur's own mind. She left money. She'd been saving it from her pension. She left money for me to take my family on a vacation, to just be together. Arthur stood in the bright, impersonal hospital lobby, clutching the photo and the gift card. The constant hum of the hospital seemed to fade into a distant, irrelevant buzz. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He wasn't just the janitor, the unnoticed cleaner. Mabel had seen to that. She had made him visible. She had given him a purpose that extended far beyond the mopped floors and disinfected surfaces. He looked at David, a man who had also just been seen by his mother in a way he perhaps never had been before. 2 men from completely different worlds, connected by the profound love and wisdom of an unseen woman. "She was something else," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion. David nodded, wiping his eyes. "She really was." Without another word, Arthur turned and walked out of the lobby doors into the morning sun. He didn't go to his car, he just stood there, feeling the warmth on his face. He pulled out his old flip phone, his fingers trembling, not with age, but with anticipation. He found the number he so rarely called. He took a deep breath, Mabel's words echoing in his mind. "Life is now," he pressed call. It rang once, twice. "Dad?" A young man's voice answered, sounding surprised. "Michael," Arthur said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "Son, I was wondering, are you free for dinner next week?" He could almost hear Mabel's smile in the silence that followed.